Hello, welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, hosted by me, Jack Perks. Professionally, I'm a wildlife cameraman, but I dabble in podcasting, and each Tuesday we release an episode as I have a chat with scientists, artists, filmmakers, and passionate people all about nature in a light-hearted and certainly not serious way. Well, hello there, how are we all doing? I'm continuing the theme of rivers with the podcast by having Alan Henshaw on today. Now, Alan is the farm manager for the Environment Agency's Calverton Fish Farm. We talk about what a fish farm is, why they're needed, and what they actually do. Calverton's only down the road from where I live, so I popped down to go meet Alan. He's a lovely bloke and we had a fantastic chat. But before we get to that, I'm going to mention buymeacoffee.com. Now, this is a website where you can support the podcast. I run this all on my own, I'm not funded, and I'm currently not sponsored. So the only way that I can make any income and continue making these podcasts is with the support of you, the listener. There's a link in the description. You can donate whatever you can afford, and we're trying to raise money currently to get a new microphone, 500 quid. Currently, we're 75% of the way there, so we've nearly done it. So whatever you can spare is greatly appreciated. What we normally do as well is if you leave a comment, we'll read that out in the next podcast. Now, I'm having to record this introduction early, so I haven't got any messages to read out this week because I'm actually in Scotland when this podcast goes out as I'm trying to film salmon. Obviously very on brand for me filming fish. But let's get back onto today's topic as I go down to Calverton Fish Farm and have a good old chinwag with Alan Henshaw. Well, morning, Alan.
Morning.
We are sat at Calverton. Just talk me through the process here. We've got a load of stock ponds out behind us. What is it that you actually do here?
Okay, we've got 32 ponds and our job is to produce fish, coarse fish, for stocking into rivers and lakes throughout the whole of England. All of the work that we do here is funded by anglers' rod licences. We couldn't do it without anglers buying a rod licence.
When was Calverton set up?
Ooh, a long time ago. We're talking 1939, so it's even before my time even. And originally it was a trout farm. And they built it all through the war, which always amazes me because you'd think they've got other things that...
Other
priorities, yeah. So they built it all through the war, and it was a trout farm for many years. And then in the mid-70s, they split the farm into two. Half of it was an experimental unit, which was run by Keith Easton, who was my first boss. And half of it was still trout. And then in the early 80s or mid-80s, 1985, they closed the trout side down and we've converted this over to a coarse fish farm. And then we expanded the farm in the early 90s. So our job, as I say, is to produce coarse fish. And we produce around about 500,000 fish per year. So that's a lot of fish.
And what species have you got here? Which ones do you stock?
Well, we start with grayling and dace in the spring when we're spawning the fish. And then we do the chub, the barbel, the roach and the bream. Then along comes crucian carp, or crucians rather, then rudd, and then we finish off with tench. So we do 9 species in all.
So who decides, right, we're going to do this species as opposed to... Why not any gudgeon or something like? So why those 9 species? They're the most popular, or they're in trouble, or what? Why those?
They're the species that the fishery officers throughout the whole of the country ask us for,
right?
And they put requests in for fish, and then we monitor those requests, and then we sort of what's the word I'm looking for? We produce what is wanted. Now, in terms of species like gudgeon and bleak, it's a very good point. The trouble with gudgeon and bleak, they're a very small fish, obviously, you know. They only live for 2 or 3 years, 4 years at the most. So it's very difficult for us to spawn them and then get them to a size where we can stock them out. And frankly, we are venue constrained. We haven't got enough room to produce any more than the 9 species that we already do.
Right, so there's no fluctuation then. It might not be that one year, okay, we're going to bring this one in. It's pretty much these are the 9 that we do and that's what goes out.
We may change the numbers, so we might have a year where we go long on roach, or we might have a year where we go long on tench or on crucians, because we're producing fish not just for rivers, We're also producing fish for still waters, but as I say, we can monitor the requirements of the fish, and we can, produce fish accordingly.
Because I guess if you were going to try and do, say, perch or pike, because people are like, oh, they're quite popular for fishing, they're a bit trickier.
They are a bit trickier, and they've got rather sort of antisocial habits. We have done pike here. We did some in the very early days, and we've done we've done gudgeon, and we've done bleak, and we've done some of the smaller species, and we produce those so that if we know that if you've got mummy bleak and daddy bleak, you've got baby bleak, and the progeny we use to produce a key that biologists use to identify juvenile fish. So we've done them. But yeah, the thought of producing pike on the farm is fraught with difficulty, because you just need a few to get into your ponds, and then they're going to do you a favour.
I guess as well, if you've got a pond full of little pike, eventually you're just going to have one very fat pike, aren't you?
Exactly the point. Exactly the point. And I mean, back in the early days, we did actually produce pike, and then we thought, well, we'll grow a few on, and we put some in a tank. And I think we started out with 20 in a tank, and I think within a few short weeks we were down to 4, one in each corner.
Gladiator.
And then it was kind of an arms race then, and so we took them out but there would have been, logically, we would have finished up with one pike in the pond. Yeah,
it's amazing, really, isn't it? And to the uninitiated, they might think, well, why do we need a fish farm? Like, what's the purpose?
Well, in the early days, when it was set up, as I say, it was a trout farm, and we used to stock trout into still waters and reservoirs and stuff like that. When we converted it into a coarse fish farm, we targeted those species that are the most popular and the most common. However, the fact is that we're a crowded island. And for whatever reason, there are some rivers where there are populations of fish where the recruitment is not what it should be. I mean, it's all our fault. It's always down to us. It's because we put weirs across rivers to make them navigable, so we drown out the gravel. So for species like the chub and the barbel, and also the gudgeon as well, it's difficult for them to spawn. In other places, there's floods of water will come down and they will wash them away. So the recruitment is not as good as it should be. So that's our job. Our job is to simulate that recruitment that would occur naturally if there were no external factors acting on a fishery. So, and success for us is not the fish going out the door. Success for us is when we've stocked a water or a stretch of river, and then we begin to see those original progeny grow on, become sexually mature, spawn themselves, and then begin to recruit. That's what success looks like for us.
And I suppose when you compare it to other animals, so let's say that you could have a woodland and it could be full of woodpeckers and interesting butterflies and whatnot. You could clear that woodland, replant it, and those animals could recolonise because birds can fly, insects can find their way, plants can travel on the air. But if you lose fish in a river or a lake, it's very difficult for them to recolonise, isn't it? Or it can be very difficult for them to recolonise. So when you've got a place like Calverton, you can offer those fish a chance to come back when naturally they would struggle to do so.
That's a point. However, fish can swim.
They can, yes.
And fish produce lots of eggs. I mean, that's part of their reproductive strategy. We're talking about species like dace, for instance. It's only a small fish, but the female might have as much as 20% of her body weight in eggs, which may be as many as, you're talking about sort of 12, 14, 16,000 eggs inside. So they produce lots and lots of eggs. Fisheries will still waters obviously won't, because there's no influx, but for rivers they will recolonise and they will repopulate, but it will take many years. What we're able to do is we're able to pump prime, if you like. We can get them back and recovered much faster just by doing some selected stockings. For still waters, that's different. You get a total wipeout in a still water, and it would take many, many, many years, and the species that you would get back probably wouldn't be the ones that you'd lost. But so nature is very, very resilient. We just don't give it much of a chance often.
Yeah, it's the kind of classic line from Jurassic Park, isn't it? Nature finds a way.
Yes.
What about things like genetics? So, because obviously you're stocking fish all over the country, do you have to think, okay, well, if we've got fish in the Trent and you're spawning them, can you then put them in other rivers, or is that going to mess things up a little bit?
One of the species that we do grayling is part of the trout and grayling strategy. So when we're restocking grayling, and we only grow the grayling on for probably 2 months maximum, and then we stock them out into the rivers, we always get broodstock from that river system, because that's part of the grading strategy and the genetics and all the rest of it. For coarse fish, it's a different argument altogether. Coarse fish have been moved around for the Victorians, were really hot on that kind of thing, and the waters have become muddied, and there's no evidence to suggest that genetically the fish from the Trent aren't suited to the river, some of the rivers in around London and stuff. Okay. So it's not an argument that we need to pay much attention to. No. What we do is we make sure that the broodstock sites that we've identified have got good populations, and there are no other underlying issues with those populations. And the Trent is such a fantastic river. You know, the fishing on the Trent is now better than since, well, I don't know, the last 150 years, probably even more. You know, the fishery is just an amazing river, and with, you know, specimens of each species, but more importantly, a wide size range as well. So we're seeing good recruitment, which is the important bit.
And I guess biosecurity must be pretty important as well. So when you're bringing fish into the farm and when you're stocking them out into other rivers, like how rigorous a process is that? Like, are you going through a fine-tooth comb for every fish to make sure they're not carrying anything? Like, how does that all work?
Well, we don't keep adult fish on the farm, so we use wild fish. So at any time, our fish that we stock out are only one generation away from wild. The advantage of that is that means we've identified broodstock sites where there are thousands of fish. So we only sample a small subset of that population. So we've got the genetic variation. Biosecurity is something that we are very, very, very keen on. And when the fish come onto the farm, we assume they're absolutely lousy with the parasites, which they're not. But naturally, fish in the wild have parasites, and we don't want them on the farm. So when we bring them back, everything is isolated. The farm is broken up into different zones. All the discharge from the hatchery is ozonated, so there's no way that fish from, say, the kennet, for instance, when we bring them here, so grayling or dace, you know, they may have a particular parasite that's only native to the kennet. We don't want it in the Trent catchment, but those fish are completely isolated. We keep them for 2 weeks, usually less than a week, and then they go back to the river where we got them from originally. And we always produce more larvae than we need, and so we put a load of extra larvae back in as well. So we make sure that our broodstock collection isn't having any effect on the recruitment for that native stretch. But biosecurity, everything's disinfected, everything's colour coded. Yeah, we're really, really hot on that.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And you mentioned the late Keith Easton earlier, and I thought I'd bring it up about burbot, because he was burbot mad. And I've spoken over the years about burbot, and I know there are rumblings at the minute about potentially bringing them back. And I think there's been conversations with you about it, but it would be tricky to do it here. Is that right? Like to have them at Calverton? Or is this all classified yet?
Burbot is unfinished business. We have spawned burbot, but not here at the farm. We did it at the university with a guy called Dr. Jim Reeder, and also Keith. Keith was my first boss. And I'll be always forever grateful to him, and you know, and his ability to generate ideas and his vision for it. And certainly burbot was something that he was very, very keen on. We've come close a few times. Ian Welby at Brooksby, they did very, very well. They spawned them, and but it's unfinished business. Now, whether we're going to be involved in that or not, who knows? But certainly Keith was the main driving force. Without Keith, the farm wouldn't be here. And every one of the lads here knows the debt that we owe to him. And I worked with him for a long time, and he was just a great man.
Yeah. So we'll see. I know I'm speaking to Norfolk Rivers Trust, and I know they're trying to push the ball. So maybe in the future. Well, look, you've got me excited. So shall we go and have a look at some of these stock ponds and see how it's all done?
Can do.
Okay, so we're outside in the farm now. So what's happening, Alan?
Well, the lads are sorting through fish. One thing that we do a lot more of nowadays is polyculture. So we grow 5 or 6 species together. The only downside of that is that at some stage we've got to separate them out again. But we've found that the fish grow much faster, in better condition, and I think also it suits them for life in the wild a bit more, because they'll be living in a community of fish.
So they're sort of on like a fun slide for fish, I guess is one way to describe it. They're all in a big bowl. They go down this little slide and they're going into a net in a big tub of water.
Yeah.
So that's what have we got? Is it chub? Is that what we're sorting through?
There's all different species.
Okay.
You can see that.
Oh yeah, I see. Yep.
The fish have just been introduced now. There are crucians in there. There's chub in there. And what they'll do is they'll allow one species to come down into the net. They're all being counted, so the counter will count 30,000 fish an hour, and it will be 99% accurate. But they need to be separated, so that's what the lads are doing now. They're separating the fish into different species and they're counting them. So we know to the thin how many fish went into these ponds, and we know to the thin how many fish come out as well. And we'll sample as well.
Is there a big difference? I mean, I guess you're going to have some that just pop the clogs, aren't you? That's just nature, isn't it? But is it pretty good? Because this is, I guess, a 5-star hotel for fish, pretty much, isn't it? They're getting healthcare, they're getting food, they're getting a nice... So I imagine they've got a pretty good life in there.
Yeah, the survival rate is high.
Yeah.
And it's certainly higher than it would be in the wild, because we discourage predators. We've got strings over the ponds, so that will discourage the cormorants from coming
right.
in. The whole of the farm is fenced, so we're not going to have problems with mink or with otters. We have kingfisher, or we have herons. You know, they're I won't say they're welcome, but they don't do us any damage. So we let them just do what they do. The survival rate is sort of high 80s, low 90%, which is considerably higher than you would get in the wild.
And are these this year's? Are these all from this year?
No, these are 2 years.
These are 2 years. I was going to say they've put on some weight if they're a year old.
Yeah, you can see the fish.
Yeah, wow. They're really shiny, those chub, aren't they? Great condition. Beautiful.
They are, and we pride ourselves in that. And of course, the important thing is that the fish that we're stocking are fit for purpose. They've been grown in flowing water. You can grow them in still waters, but then when you put them into a river, they're just not fit enough. And that was one of the problems in the early days, before we started here. People would net still waters and put fish into rivers. Well, they're just not fit enough. These fish, they know what natural food is. They met a predator. They've been challenged in a number of ways. They know what habitat is, but they've been grown in flowing water, so they are, these are marathon runner fish. You can put them into a river, and the red mussel, which is the small amount of mussel along the flanks of each side of the fish, there's lots of that red mussel, and that red mussel, they can use that 24/7. Whereas the white mussel, which is the bulk of the mussel, they only use that fight or flight. So this is really important. So we jump through lots and lots of hoops trying to make sure these fish are fit for purpose, because we stock them out. There'd be no point stocking them out if they then get washed downstream.
No, you could stock hundreds from a still water, but if they're not going to make it, what's the point? You're better off having fish that can actually cope with the challenges they're going to face when they go back into the river.
And that's the exact point, and that's what used to happen. Some rivers that we stock, they'd been stocked for a number of years previously with stillwater fish, and the fish had never stuck. Whereas the River Don in Sheffield is a good example. We began to stock it and the fish stuck. And then, as you know now, the Don is a really, really good fishery.
Yeah,
and that's built on the basis of improvements in water quality, and also the pump priming stocking that we did.
So you're moving thousands of fish around the country. Like, how do you move thousands of fish around? Like, what's the kind of process? You've got a big van or something? Like, how do they move, and how do you keep them healthy and happy while you're doing it?
Well, that's the important part, because 18 months of hard work to get them to the size of stocking can all be wasted if you don't transport them properly. We've got our own vehicles, 2 vehicles with tanks on the back. Each tank has an oxygen supply. Each tank, the oxygen level is monitored. We also put 1 or 2 bits in the water that help to replace lost mucus and just help with conditioning the fish. And we can be down in south of London. We even transport fish as far as Devon and Cornwall, and the fish arrive in tip-top condition.
It's amazing. It's such a big operation. I think it's easy to just think that you've just got a couple of ponds, chuck some fish in and crack on, but it's almost industrial in a way, and I don't mean that as a negative thing, but it's a big operation that you've got here at Calverton. There's tanks everywhere. There's almost like a big polytunnel. There's ponds, solar panels. It's an amazing thing, really, and I guess most anglers don't realise the scale of it. It's incredible, absolutely incredible.
It's taken us many years to get to this kind of these facilities, and we're continuously developing our techniques, trying to improve the way we do things, trying to reduce the amount of energy that we use is a big one. As you mentioned, the solar panels and stuff. It works really, really well, and the staff here, they're such an expert team. They love what they do. They're all fishermen, and that certainly is a real asset and a blessing.
They'll be, instead of counting sheep, they'll be counting crucians and things, won't they, when they go to sleep tonight? You could just tell, like, it's mental going through all those different fish. Absolutely incredible.
And of course, we're going to go through all these fish. We've only got a short window because we can only start harvesting the ponds. Well, the beginning of October is the earliest that we can start because the water temperatures are still too high. So by harvesting the ponds, we are going to have to get all of these fish harvested, sorted, and then delivered before, hopefully, Christmas. So it's going to be a really intense couple of months for us, 2 or 3 months now.
Yeah, not long,
it's
really.
our busiest time of the year.
Yeah, like Santa for fish, aren't you, almost? Like getting them around the country and getting them. Incredible. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating, Alan, seeing how all this works. It's incredible. If people want to find out more about Calverton, what's the best place to go to?
Well, we used to have a nice little website, but we haven't got that anymore. There's a very good video on YouTube, which was made by the Angling Trust, and I think that probably encapsulates everything that we do.
Okay.
So I would point them in that direction.
I'll chuck a link to that in the description so people can check that out. But thanks for having me today. It's been great to see what you guys are all doing, and any excuse to waffle about fish. But cheers, buddy.
It's been a pleasure.
That was Alan Henshaw, absolutely full of enthusiasm for fish, as is his staff, and they've all helped me out massively over the years. Whenever I've needed to get pictures of fish eggs or fish fry, they've always been on hand to help me, so they're a fantastic bunch of people. I will put that Angling Trust video in the description as well, because that gives a really good idea of what they're all about there. I think in recent years, the Environment Agency has increasingly come under scrutiny. And whenever I've spoken to staff, you can see a sort of a sense of frustration sometimes. And I'm not saying that Alan or any of his staff have said this to me. I mean, I work with the Environment Agency all over the country. And I feel like one of the concerns is that it's underfunded, which is a fair thing to say. Increasingly over the years, even in the 10 years that I've done freelance work for the Environment Agency, the amount of staff that have been let go and budgets that have been cut, they are struggling. And one of the things that would be immensely helpful is more funding. The Environment Agency, essentially the fisheries arm anyway, at least, could definitely do with more funding and could go a long way to help them actually do their job. So it's something that hopefully will happen. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. But Calverton is a great example of something that is being done right because, and we touched on it briefly in that chat, but when you lose fish, particularly from a lake or from stretches of rivers, it can be difficult for them to come back. It's not like butterflies or birds or plants that can self-seed and recolonise. Once you lose fish, they struggle to come back. If you've got a load of tench in a lake and they all die out, they're not going to come back on their own, or they're incredibly unlikely to come back on their own. So Calverton is able to fill those gaps and increase biodiversity of fish when it's highly likely they wouldn't come back on their own. So I do think that they are filling a very important role, and it's all being funded by rod licenses, by anglers essentially. So it's great work that they do. Absolutely fantastic. Now, if you listened to last week's podcast, you'll know that I was going to talk about how many downloads that we've got and some of the most popular episodes that we've done. So we've reached 60,000 downloads, which for a one-man band independent podcast is bloody good, just to kind of put that into context. It means that we're routinely in the top 10 nature podcasts, often in the top 5. So we're doing pretty damn well to say that I'm just sort of steering the ship on me Todd. Now, in no particular order, I'm going to go through the 10 most downloaded episodes. So let's say that you're brand new to this podcast and you think, I wonder which ones have got the most downloads. I'm going to go through it. And in next week's episode, I'll talk about my favourite, the top 5 favourite, which aren't necessarily the same. So the first one up is A Career in Wildlife Filmmaking with Bertie Gregory. Bertie's just released a series on Disney+, so that's probably why that's doing quite well. But he's a nice bloke. I've met him a few times. amazing wildlife camera operator. I think he's only in his late 20s, so he's not that old either, but he's absolutely smashing it. So if you want to find out about what it's like to be a wildlife filmmaker, you can do worse things than to start with that podcast. Second one up is what's the wildlife photography industry like with Josh Jaggard. Josh is a really good friend of mine. If you're more interested in the still side of then that's a great podcast to listen to. I used to live with Josh. He was best man at a wedding. I know Josh incredibly well, and we have a very frank and open discussion about what it's like being a wildlife photographer. I had the pleasure of having Jules Howard on the podcast, and we talked about debunking pond myths. So all those things that you've heard about ponds, birds bringing eggs in, and newts eating all your tadpoles, all those sort of things, we talk about that in that podcast, and we go through some of the things that are correct, some of the things that are absolute rubbish, and just talk about garden ponds. Now, I often have anglers on the podcast, and I had Matt Hayes, he came on, and we talk about his career in angling, all the shows that he's done, and what he thinks about some of the more recent shows as well. Richard Pearce came on the podcast, and we talked about great white sharks, and specifically, are they in the UK? The answer might surprise you. We've had a lot of podcasts about sewage and generally poor treatment of rivers, and Joe Crowley from The One Show and Countryfile came on, and we talk about why raw sewage is being dumped into British rivers. Ben Burville came on, as we talked about close encounters with grey seals. Ben is a doctor, but in his spare time is a wildlife cameraman, and it has some incredible encounters with grey seals. Now I'm going to talk about the top 3 now. These are the top 3 downloaded episodes in no particular order. Record fish and burbot with Chris Yates. So Chris Yates is an absolute legend in the angling world. He was the record carp holder, and we talk about everything from hen harriers, catching carp, and burbot, which ties on nicely to number 2, which was a podcast completely dedicated to burbot. I went over to Belgium and I interviewed some of the experts about burbot and how potentially we're going to release them into the UK. The cogs are turning, and that episode was called Reintroducing Britain's Lost Fish, the Burbot. And then last but not least, Catching Monster Fish with Jeremy Wade. So unsurprisingly, that was one of the more popular episodes. Jeremy came on the podcast. We have a good talk about his career, all the fish that he's caught, all the weird and wonderful places that he's been, and also about the upcoming film that myself and Jeremy are working on together called Britain's Hidden Fishes. So those are the top 10 most popular downloaded episodes for the podcast. So if you've not listened to any of those, it might be worth checking them out. Now next week I'll talk about the 5 favourite episodes that I've done recording. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at TitBearded, and you can also follow me on Twitter at JackPerksPhoto. Over on Facebook, it's the Bearded Tits Podcast, and my Facebook is Jack Perks Wildlife Media. On Instagram, it's at FishTwitcher, and you can also follow the YouTube channel Jack Perks Wildlife Media. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. It was a great one to record. Next week is an episode of Jack Does Stuff, and this time I'm going zander fishing. I'm heading down to the River Trent, and I'm going to talk all about zander. Will I catch one? You'll have to tune in to find out. This has been the Bearded Tits Podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.